Wonderful story of love. Tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love. Wake the immortal strain. Angels with rapture announce it. Shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. 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 Though you are far away. Wonderful story.
All right, so the Gospel of Mark, we've been talking about Jesus' identity. We're going to focus on what starts taking place in chapter 9 and verse 14. When they came to the disciples, they saw a great crowd around him, the scribes arguing with them. And immediately all the crowd, when they saw him, was greatly amazed and ran up to him and greeted him. And he asked them, "What are you arguing about with them?" And someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you, for he has a spirit that makes him mute. And whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast it out, and they were not able." And he answered them, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." And they brought the boy to him, and when the spirit saw him, immediately it convulsed the boy, and he fell on the ground and rolled about, foaming at the mouth. And Jesus asked his father, "How long has this been happening to him?" And he said, "From childhood. And it's often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Now notice the construction of that question, if you can do anything. Jesus says, if you can. All things are possible for one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." And when Jesus saw that a crowd came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." And after crying out and convulsing him terribly, it came out, and the boy was like a corpse, so that most of them said, "He is dead." But Jesus took him by the hand, lifted him up, and he arose. And when he had entered the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why could we not cast it out?" And he said to them, "This kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer." Listen, that last statement is extremely important. Okay? Because it sets the tone for what the discussion is actually about. This is one of those places where many, many people make a terrible mistake in application of the principles of what's going on. They believe that this is all about the fact that in order for a miracle to be worked, a person must have faith. And you even hear this expressed by people today. Supposed people who can heal by faith, people come to them and it doesn't work, and what is their cry? You lack faith. This is on you. If you only believed, then this would work. And this is one of the places they go to build that foundation and to say that that's what's going on here. We got to be very careful and apply this very carefully. The lack of faith under consideration here was not in the healer alone. It was not in the one who was healed at all. Where did the lack of faith reside? In the one who was asking. In the case of the disciples, the implication is that they also may have doubted their ability to cast it out. But did Jesus doubt his ability to cast it out? And did he not cast it out because the boy, by the way, do we know how old this boy was? We don't. Yeah, the implication is that he is older. I think the language here is suggesting this is the man's son. We don't know exactly how old the son is, but when he's asked how long has this been going on, his answer is since childhood. So it's been going on for a long time, since he was a small boy. How long exactly that is, we're not told. He doesn't say it's been going on for 25 years since he was a small boy. It just says, well, from his childhood, which would indicate that he's no longer in his childhood. But it's a long-term thing. Now, verses 18 and 19 are important in understanding this. When it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast him out, and they were not able. And listen to what it says. He answered them, O faithless generation. Do you notice how broad his response is? O faithless generation. He's saying that the asker lacks faith, that the disciples lacked faith, that everyone, and he's painting with a broad brush. He's not saying that every single individual necessarily, but that just in general, the generation lacked faith. And then he asks this question, how long will I be with you? That actually gets to the crux of the purpose for the miracles, the purpose for his teaching, the purpose for what's going on. We've talked about the fact that from 827 through 932, generally what's going on here is Jesus' identity is being confirmed, recognizing that he is the Christ, that he is the Son of God, that he is God with us, is the focus of what's going on here. When he says, how long am I going to be with you? He's saying, look, I can't keep helping you along. For there's a time coming when I'm not going to be here anymore. Then what are you going to do? If you can't come to me, what are you going to do? If my disciples lack the faith to carry out my will, what's that going to leave us with? If the generation doesn't start listening and coming to faith, and then I'm gone, what's going to happen? And so that's really the focus of this. And then the other thing is, when we get to the end of it, we read that statement in verse 29, this cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. That means that the focus of the faith discussion of this text is our prayers. And so I'm going to read to you, this is from R.C.H. Linsky's commentary, his little section that he deals with about these kinds of questions, because I think he does a really good job and I can't improve on it. So I'm just going to read to you what he says. Trench may serve as an example of those who, on the strength of Christ dealing with this Father, assume that faith is necessary for all such miracles and that absence of faith ties the hands of Jesus. So Trench was another scholar. He says Trench makes that argument. There are lots of other people he's suggesting that fall into that category as well, who think that this is about the faith tying the hands of Jesus, or the lack of faith tying the hands of Jesus. He says, for one thing, they overlook the fact that it's not the Father that's healed, but the little son, and nothing is said about the son's faith. As far as the Father's concerned, his is a case of prayer. He indeed asked a gift that is a miracle, but all he does is to ask and to pray for it. And by the way, those are synonymous terms. A prayer is simply a request. We actually use that word in our language outside of the religious context, where we're not talking about praying to God, and we use it in the court system. When you ask a judge for something, you make a prayer. And so that's all that. This is simply a request. It's a formal request. And so he says all he does is to ask and pray for it. Now, prayer must indeed be uttered by faith in order to be heard. The Bible is perfectly clear about that. It's just replete, Old Testament and New, about that point. Prayer must indeed be uttered in faith in order to be heard, whether the hearing consists of a miracle or something else. That disposes of the confusion of thought in this case. This is not about whether there was enough faith for Jesus to heal the boy, whether there was enough faith in the Father for the disciples to heal the boy. No, this is about whether or not there was enough faith for the request to be heard. As it regards the miracles, however, they are not dependent on faith, but only on the will of Jesus. This is clear in all cases where Jesus heals without faith on the part of men and seeks to establish faith after the healing. In John chapter 5, verse 1, etc. The impotent man at the pool of Bethesda did not even know Jesus' name when he was healed. We're shown in John 9 how after his eyes were opened, the blind man gradually came to faith. How many demonics believed before they were freed? Think of the two mentioned in 5:1. Nor did anyone who had faith plead for them. Did the widow of Nain or her dead son believe before the miracle? This is indeed true. Jesus wrought few or no miracles where the population was unbelieving and hostile. Chapter 6 and verse 5 made reference to the fact that he didn't do many miracles there because of their unbelief. But this was done for the simple reason that miracles would have been wasted on such people. And so that's the focus of this, is on identifying who Jesus is, identifying the power of Jesus, and identifying our relationship to him in that power. In order for him to hear us and respond, we need to be a people who are convinced of who he is and that he's able to respond. You notice even the Father, when he gets confronted about this question, and Jesus says to him, if you can, you're asking if you can? You don't know that I'm able to help? And then he says, all things are possible for one who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, I believe. Help my unbelief. How was he going to help his unbelief? If he believes, does he have unbelief? I believe. Help my unbelief. And that gets to the crux of the way miracles work. Miracles don't make unbelievers start believing. Miracles confirm the belief of believers. I believe that you're able. Help me believe more. Let me know. Let me see. And by the way, when you get to the end, for instance, of, was it John's gospel? Many other signs Jesus performed in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written that you may believe, and that believing you may have life in his name. Listen, he didn't work miracles in Cana because they would have been wasted on those people. But for people who have already accepted that he's the teacher, those things are confirmation that he's not just a teacher. For those people who believe that he's a prophet, those things were confirmation that he's not just a prophet of many. By the way, guess what? Islam believes that Jesus was a prophet, just like they believe that Muhammad was a prophet. Well, because Muhammad came later, and they like what Muhammad said, and they have decided to believe that, then yes, he does take a little less than position, the same way that for us, Paul is more important than Hosea. Now, I'm not suggesting that he should be, but I'm suggesting for most of us, he is. Because why? Well, we believe that Paul's writing is more applicable to us because he's from this testament. I would not necessarily make that distinction so strongly. I do believe that Paul was living under this dispensation and dealing with issues that directly affect those who are under the covenant of Christ. But Hosea's words are just as much the word of God and just as valuable to us, else God wouldn't preserve them. Why did he preserve the word of God? But why does the New Testament argue that the Old Testament is recorded for us? Both in the book of Romans and the book of 1 Corinthians, it says what? These things were recorded for your learning upon those who the end of the ages have come. The reason why we have the Old Testament is for our dispensation, our people, so that we understand God and we understand what God has done and we understand these things. It is the combined knowledge of the Old and New Testaments that we get a full picture of all that God has done and of who Jesus is. And so what he's talking about here is the role of these things on solidifying the confidence that we have in the identity of Jesus. You'll recall in Luke 16, there's this wonderful story of a rich man and a poor man. That poor man have a name? Lazarus. Both of those people died in the story, right? What happens to Lazarus? He goes to the bosom of Abraham. Now, all that means is that he is the same place that Abraham is. He's close to Abraham. Abraham, we know, is a godly person, so Abraham was in a good place. So was Lazarus in a good place. What about the rich man? He died. What happened? By the way, I'll also add this real quick. When Lazarus dies, it says the angels came and carried him there. When the rich man died, it simply says that he died and he was buried. No angels carrying him to a place of comfort. He died and was buried, and he was in a place of torment. He's looking for help, right? Give me some relief. I'm in agony. Just let him dip his finger in some water and touch it to the tip of my tongue and give me just a slight bit of relief. I'm in agony here. Oh, sorry, that can't happen. There is a chasm, a gulf between where we are and where you are, and you can't cross over between the two. You're where you are, we're where we are, and we can't help you, and it's just the way it is. He comes to understand that. So his next thing is to say what? Okay. So you can't help me, but can you send Lazarus to warn my brothers? Because I don't want my brothers to come here. And the response says, they have Moses and the prophets. And he says, no, I understand that, but if someone would come from the dead to warn them, that they would believe. And what is the response that comes? Not even if someone should come back from the dead. Well, if they reject Moses and the prophets, they won't listen if one comes back from the dead either. Miracles were not to take people who had no faith and create faith. Miracles were for those people who did accept the testimony to solidify and confirm that faith. Just more evidence. They were the testimony of God to go along with the testimony of the prophet. Okay? And so that's part of what he's talking about here. He said to them, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. Prayer is involved in this, and if you don't think that God is listening, and you don't believe that God is able to do the things that you're asking, do you think asking really does any good? Now, think of those movie prayers where someone says, well, God, I don't know if you're really there, but if you are, I really need some help.
That reminds me of Romans 8, when the Holy Spirit intercedes for those in covenant. It's our inner goal. We don't even know how.
Right. And so I think that brings up an interesting point of discussion. Do we even know what to ask for? Now, we think we do. We always think we know what we need. Sometimes what we think we need is not at all what we need. We need sometimes the exact opposite. And my prayers have become modified a lot over the years because of my growing awareness of that fact. Because see, I'll tell you, when loved ones of mine get sick, I do believe that prayer for the sick is taught in the scriptures. And I do believe that God is able to help and willing to help. But listen, the answer isn't always that the sickness be put down and that health return and that life continue on this earth. That's not always what's best for anyone or anything. And so it's not my job to tell God what to do. It's my job to do what? Say, Lord, here's the horrible situation, and this is tearing me up. May your will be carried out in this case. Do what is right, what is good. And then I am in the position of doing what? Accepting the outcome. And accepting that outcome as what is best. That is how, for instance, 1 Thessalonians 4 comes into play when he talks about us not grieving those that we love who die like those who have no hope. I don't have to say, oh, well, I prayed for them and they didn't get better. They died anyway. And so God doesn't do. I have to learn to say what? This is in the hands of God. And he's done what is right. And if this person was faithful to God, then God was faithful to them. And so I don't have to grieve as if I've just lost someone who had no hope. I grieve as one who understands the hope that they had. And I grieve as one who understands that, for instance, as Paul did, on more than one occasion as he faced death, said, hey, you know what? The truth be told is it's better for me if I die. But that may not be the will of God. And in one case, he actually said, it's better for me if I die, but I know it's better for you if I live, and so I'm going to live on because I still have obligations. We have to understand that faith is confidence in the will of God and confidence in what God has said, in belief that what he said is right. And so it's not God's promise that he's going to heal all diseases. It's God's promise that he's going to do what? Preserve our souls. Come unto me, all you weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Okay, what kind of rest? Now, we would jump to the conclusion of what? That he's going to remove all of our burdens and troubles and make our life easy. That's not what he says, though, is it? He says, come and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me. I'm meek and lowly of heart. You shall find rest for your souls, not your bodies. So help my unbelief is to get me from the point where not only do I believe that God is there and that God is able, but that God is doing and that what is done is what is right and what is good. What if it was not Jesus' will to heal this boy? Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. Okay, then the demon stays. Do I still believe? Now, see, there's a test for you. I go to the doctor because I'm feeling poorly and I get a diagnosis that I don't like. I know I've got friends who have ALS. I've got friends who have other horrible diseases. We got a person sitting in the room right here that suffers from Parkinson's. That is not a walk in the park. I don't know. I've never asked this individual, but I suspect that there have been prayers for help. if the ALS continues and progresses, if the Parkinson's continues and progresses, if the cancer continues and progresses, if my life is not extended like Hezekiah's for 15 years, but instead I do die that night, do I still believe? You see, that's Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego kind of faith. Listen, you can throw us into this fire, and our God whom we serve is able to deliver us, but even if he doesn't deliver us, we can't do anything but serve him. I know he's able, but it may not be his will. And if it's not, well, I'm okay with that too.
But also in doing so, God's ways are higher than our ways, and his thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Therefore, whenever God moves, we don't need to understand. We just need to know that there's a lesson that's going to be taught.
That's, I think, a good observation. And by the way, there are always lessons to be learned, no matter what happens. And we have got to work to have the kind of confidence in God that we don't wonder if he can or if he, we simply know that we ask and he'll do what is right.
Said in 29.
I'm sorry?
Don't you think that's part of it said in verse?
Yeah, essentially, yes.
They're questioning their ability. They haven't decided, they haven't achieved his obligation.
And there's no room for doubt in this, and there's no contingents when you're dealing with God. I'm going to believe if you heal me. If you don't heal me, I'm not going to believe. And yet, but have you ever heard anyone, and I'm going to put this in heavy quotes, I hate this terminology, I want you to know that up front, give their testimony and say, hey, this is what the situation was, and I prayed to God, and it just fell all apart, and everything went to the bits, but that's how I know I believe in God. You ever heard anybody give that testimony? Or is it always, look, this was going on, it was terrible, there was no hope for me, I prayed to God, it all worked out wonderful, and turned out exactly the way I wanted it? That's how I know that that's the way we do. You ever heard of the On a Wing and a Prayer? That's based on a fellow that lives here in Louisiana. He was not a pilot. He was on an airplane. The pilot died, and he ended up landing the plane safely. And the whole thing is about faith. Okay, it's a good movie, by the way. Watch it if you hadn't. It's a neat story, and it's relatable because, you know, it's about people who live right here in our state and all kind of cool things like that. And Dennis Quaid does a good job in the movie. And so anyway, but here's my point. Had the plane crashed, it still was a God. Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. See, there's the attitude. Yes, I believe that you're able. Let me see what you're able to do. And I'll accept what you do. I will have stronger belief whatever you do. That is what we need to be working towards. Yes, ma'am. Last comment. I'm going to leave it to you, so say something brilliant. I agree completely. I think that's a great place to end. The clock says I have to stop, and so thank you for your presence.
Wonderful story of love, tell it to me again. Wonderful story of love, wake the immortal string. Angels with rapture announce it, shepherds with wonder receive it. Sinner, oh, won't you believe it? Wonderful story of love. Wonderful story.